speaker is Dr. John O'Neill. John is a professor of global and indigenous health and a former dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University and a fellow in the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Mike Smith Foundation for Health Research, and he's also past chair. He's a past member of the advisory board of the National Collaborating Centre on Aboriginal Health in the Public Health Agency of Canada, PHAC. He's currently working with Indigenous communities in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, supported by funding from Grand Challenges Canada, CIHR, and International Development Research Center. I remember before COVID, I meant to meet John in Thailand. That's where I go and volunteer. And I think that didn't happen for some logistical reasons. John is going to speak to Indigenous people and colonization and how that impacted it, and the history and principles and practices surrounding that. John, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me here. I'm going to share screen here and see if it works. And you can see my screen?
Yes,
and you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so again, thank you for inviting me to this. I've been listening over the last hour, very interesting conference so far, very interesting perspectives. When Arun asked me to do this, I was a bit hesitant, as he knows. I'm not sure the work that I'm doing fits well with the general framework of the conference, but I'll try and offer some insights into how Indigenous people at least approach the issue of health and healing, and perhaps that will be useful for this conference. So I'm not getting the...
Down at the bottom, you can...
yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah, I have two screens going here.
Oh.
First of all, the land acknowledgement. I am also very grateful to live and work in the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and Coquitlam nations, where the SFU campuses are located. Today, I live on the traditional territory of the Kikite First Nation, where the city of New Westminster was founded on the banks of the Fraser. And the Kikite are probably in BC the First Nations that have had the longest history with colonization. And their territories have been essentially overwhelmed by the development of the city of New Westminster. I also would like to acknowledge and remember the residential school genocide. And I get emotional every time I talk about it, I'm sorry. Practiced by the Canadian government and the Christian churches against Indigenous people throughout much of our history. I want to remember today, particularly the 215 children whose remains recently found in unmarked graves on the grounds of the Kamloops Residential School. And they represent thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Indigenous children that were allowed to die in these schools from disease, starvation, neglect, and abuse. And that's an important part of our history, but it's also a very important part of understanding chronic disease in First Nation communities. The intergenerational trauma, the residential school experience in families and communities, the impact on children's development from the epigenetic level through to developmental experience plays a big role in the expression of chronic disease in these communities today. And unfortunately, this Canadian history is not unique to Canada, has also been experienced in by many other Indigenous people in many other parts of the world. So from a global perspective, I spent most of my career working in Canada with First Nations and Inuit communities particularly, but today I'm far more involved with Indigenous communities and nations globally. The United Nations estimates there are about 370 million Indigenous people in the world, and interestingly, about a third of those 370 million actually live in India, but they're also found on virtually every country, every continent, and have and constitute approximately 8% of the global population. But they also act as stewards to over 80% of the world's biodiversity. So one of the things I'll be talking about today is how important land is to Indigenous people and how important land is to their sense of health and well-being in their community and their connection with their territories. And although this sort of basic fact of stewards to 80% of the world's biodiversity means that they are often located in the more remote areas of many of the countries they're in, the mountainous areas, the forest areas, in Canada, the northern regions, in Australia, the desert regions, in Africa, the desert regions in North Africa, the more impenetrable jungle areas in other parts of Africa, and they are responsible for the territories in their areas. They include, they go by many names. Obviously, in Canada, we know people as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. In Southeast Asia, where I work mostly now, they're known as ethnic minorities. In China and other countries in Southeast Asia, ethnic minorities. In India and in other parts of Latin America, South America, and Africa as tribal peoples, Aboriginal in some places, and of course our own First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. They're very diverse. There's no sense that they share a common cultural history or even biological history, but they do share two important things in common, which impacts their health and well-being today. They share a history of colonization by the dominant society in every country that they inhabit. And they have also an ancestral approach to healing that is holistic, integrative, and reflects, as I've suggested, a very strong harmony with the natural world. Their own ancestral, cultural, and healing systems have a history of having been suppressed, colonized, and disrupted by the social and religious systems that surround them. In Canada, particularly Christianity, but in other parts of the world, Hinduism, Islam, and science. I'm describing science here as a kind of a religion, which I hope isn't offensive to anyone, but it is a set of beliefs and practices that has a similar impact on Indigenous ancestral symptoms. And as we know, if you're following, the United Nations has recently passed a resolution, or not so recently, probably almost 10 years ago now, recognizing rights to land and culture that most countries now have accepted globally, including Canada fairly recently. So now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of projects that I've been involved in and that I think reflect this common sense of connection, holistic approaches to health, connection with the world around them. One of the interesting things that I suppose I discovered in my own intellectual development back in the 90s when I was doing some work for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. In Western public health thinking, we had kind of invented a new paradigm of social determinants of health, where we began to recognize that, and these principles have been expressed here today in this conference, we began to recognize that health was not simply a reflection of biology, but that health was strongly embedded in the wider social, economic, behavioral environment that certainly, as we've heard today, behavioral factors have a huge impact on health, but we also began to recognize that social deprivation, poverty, lack of education, opportunities in education and employment, and the wider physical environment also have significant impacts on health. When I was working with the Royal Commission, we basically were kind of challenged by our Indigenous colleagues to find a way to reflect what were ancestral ideas about health, which reflected the broader connection of people to the social, economic, cultural, and physical environment, and thought of health in essentially multidimensional as part of physical, environmental, mental, and spiritual, and that the emotional, spiritual, mental, and physical aspects of a human being had a great deal to do with their health, which again, we've heard reflected in the talks today, but that the individual human being was embedded in broader social relationships, had responsibilities to those communities of people, to family and community and nation, and that all of those connections were part of a holistic understanding of health in First Nations and other Indigenous communities. This particular graphic is from the First Nations Health Association, which is a First Nations organization in BC that now is responsible for the health of First Nations throughout the province. The work that I'm currently involved in is beginning to look at biodiversity. And as I mentioned in my earlier slide, the fact that Indigenous people are stewards over, people are estimating 80% of the world's biodiversity. That link and that relationship extends throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, South America, and is fundamental to the lives of Indigenous people who live there. And in those different populations and in those different countries, almost all of those, well, not almost, all of those different communities have words in their language which express the importance of this relationship with the land around them. And I'll show you a slide in a minute, but the fundamental concept underlying those experiences, or that philosophy, connection with the land, is expressed in a phrase which translates in many cultures as, if the land isn't healthy, we can't be healthy. It's vital to protect the health of the environment around you in order to sustain your own health, the health of your communities, and the well-being of your nations. And those fundamental ideas are expressed in many Indigenous cultures in literally all parts of the world. The project that I'm involved in now, and this is how I got into this conference, I think, when Arun and I were chatting a bit about a project that I'm starting to develop. I'm part of an international group that is we use this notion of the land is healthy and people are healthy as expressed in Aramat. Aramat is a Tuareg word, tribal community in Northern Africa and many countries of Saharan Africa. And it basically reflects this concept that people are only healthy if their environment is healthy, if their social relationships are healthy, if they have governance over their well-being, if they have governance over their communities, if their traditions are protected, if their basic understanding of the way in which they can sustain their health, if those are protected. And the project that we're developing is working with those tribal communities. There's one in India, in Uttar Pradesh, that we're working with. There's two in Southeast Asia where I'm working primarily now, one in Thailand and another in Vietnam. And there are projects going on all continents, from Siberia to Sub-Saharan Africa to South America, built around this idea, this philosophical principle that health in these communities is only going to be sustained and possible by working in all of these different dimensions. Some of them probably are self-evident to the particularly folks in this conference. On the upper left quadrant, you can see strengthening Indigenous food systems, nurturing Indigenous medicine and healthcare, which reflects traditional medical practices, healing physical, spiritual relationship to nature. You know, it's interesting, I'm listening to the last talk about trying to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. Indigenous people will retreat into the forest and spend time on the land with their families, particularly elders taking youth out as a way of sort of bringing peace back into their lives and calming, particularly during times of trauma. And I would say right now in Canada, a lot of that is going on. Some of these other dimensions probably not so obvious, but part of the broader social physical environment, water security and water safety for people, healthy relationships with wild species. And this is a recognition that similar to COVID-19 and our ideas about the origins of COVID-19, the recognition that diseases can be transmitted from wildlife to humans, and maintaining the kinds of traditional systems that protect people from those diseases are part of Indigenous belief systems, sustaining Indigenous economies, and then moving into some of the broader social determinants that I said earlier reflect Indigenous ideas and practices, decolonization of the science and medicine, supporting social justice and reconciliation and healing, recognition of Indigenous rights to sustainable youth, and land back, meaning recognition of Indigenous land rights and return of land to Indigenous communities to sustain them over time. So those are my slides. I think my general thoughts here are that I think in Canada particularly, we've long recognized the rights of Indigenous people. There has been work towards resolving some of the outstanding impacts of colonization as the events of the last couple of weeks and our knowledge of residential schools increases. I think we recognize that there's a lot more work to do. I think as I suggested, their ancestral ideas about holistic and integrative health are what they need to prevent the very high prevalence of chronic diseases in their communities. And I think some of those ideas from the Canadian context are also important to remember when we're talking about Indigenous people in many other countries. So I hope this talk has been of some relevance to your conference, Arun. As I said to you when we talked early on, I wasn't sure I would be talking about things that were completely consistent with some of the other presentations today, but thank you again for inviting me to this conference.
Thank you. Minnie, if I could just say a word. Thank you, John. Not only it's relevant, it's very relevant because what we're really talking about is integrative thinking. We're not talking about ideas other than that, how we think about these problems. So what you have shared really is foundational to this. And friends, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to recognize my friend John. John was instrumental in engaging me in a very early stage when he was the dean of Simon Fraser University, and we started thinking about CINS. And Simon Fraser University and Fraser Health have been our co-founders. And John, as a dean, facilitated that exchange. So John, I want to recognize the work you started. We are continuing, and as you could see, it's starting to bear some small fruits. Long road, but it takes time. So thank you very much, and I really look forward ongoing deliberations with you on your project, especially in India, and also Simon Fraser University, because British Columbia has a unique opportunity. Bar none, a new medical school is emerging. And if we could bring integrative thinking in part of that training, I think it will be all very worthwhile, the effort. So thanks again for being here. And your talk was not only relevant, very, very meaningful and much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, no, I would echo that as well, John. I found it very informative, and I think you taking the Canadian Indigenous, I guess, environment that we've come used to learning about here in Canada, and looking at that from a broader perspective, I personally found that to be very informative. And I think what your talk really highlighted is that there are a lot more similarities than there are differences. And I think that concept of similarities in in the conversation of integrative leadership and integrative thinking fits quite nicely. So I really appreciated your talk. If people have any have any questions for John, please just put them into the chat, and we can reach out to John later. On that note, I will hand it over to Reza.
Thank you, John, again for a very inspiring talk.